Imagine waking up, heading to the window, and seeing nothing. No bright morning rays, no golden hour, just a weird, sickly gray veil hanging over everything. This isn't a scene from a post-apocalyptic Netflix show. This was real life in 536 AD. Historians now call it the worst year to be alive, and honestly, it's not even close. We're talking about a time when medieval peasants, who were already used to living in literal mud and eating boiled cabbage, looked at the sky and realized the world was fundamentally broken. For 18 months, a mysterious dry fog smothered the sun, plunging Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia into a ghostly twilight. But here's where it gets absolutely crazy. It wasn't just dark, it was freezing. Imagine a summer where it snows in July. Imagine crops turning to mush in the fields while the sun hangs in the sky like a dim, bluish ghost that casts no shadows. It was a cosmic prank that lasted over a year, and the people living through it had zero clue that the planet was essentially entering a soft reset mode. Tonight, we're diving into the shadows of 536 to figure out how humanity survived when the lights went out.
So let's set the scene. It's the early 6th century, and you're probably just a merchant, a monk, or a farmer praying your turnip harvest doesn't fail for the 3rd time this decade. Life back then wasn't exactly a 5-star resort, but it was predictable. You knew when the sun was coming up, you knew when to plant, and you knew when the seasons were changing. But then 536 hits, and suddenly the sun just quits. At first, people thought it was just a few gloomy mornings. You know the type, where you squint at the horizon and wait for the clouds to burn off. But the clouds didn't clear. Days turned into weeks, and the sun kept up this half-hearted routine like it was doing the bare minimum just to not get fired. Across Europe and Asia, it became clear that this wasn't just a rain ruined my toga kind of situation. The Byzantine historian Procopius, who wasn't exactly known for being a drama queen, wrote that the sun gave off its light without brightness. That's historian speak for, this is deeply unsettling and we're all probably going to die. Chroniclers began describing a dry fog that blanketed the world. It wasn't smoke and it wasn't mist. It was this weird, lingering grayness that refused to go away. It didn't blow off with the wind and it didn't wash away with the rain. It just hovered there, like the planet was trying to send a vague atmospheric warning that nobody was picking up. The result, a year that completely forgot how to behave. Trees stopped growing, birds started migrating in circles, and humans did what humans do best. They started blaming everything. Some said it was divine punishment, others blamed sorcery or eclipses. And let's be real, there was definitely one guy in every village blaming his neighbor's goat. But while the blame game was strong, the reality was terrifying. No sun meant a world that was getting colder and hungrier by the second, with absolutely no idea how long this cosmic nightmare was going to last. But here's where things get wild, because while the sun was busy ghosting everyone, the sky started doing things that shouldn't be physically possible. By now, the sun was technically up, but it wasn't really participating. Across the globe, people were staring at the sky like it owed them a massive explanation. What used to be a reliable, bright, and mildly judgmental sun had been replaced by a pale, low-effort disk that looked like it was calling in sick for a shift it had no intention of finishing. Seriously, you would have gotten more warmth and enthusiasm from a dying candle than the sun in 536. Eyewitnesses from Constantinople all the way to Ireland and China were reporting the exact same unsettling thing. Daylight had become indistinguishable from twilight. You'd wake up and assume it was dawn. At noon, you'd assume you were going blind. By sunset, well, good luck even figuring out when that was. The sun didn't set so much as it just wandered off quietly mid-conversation. Contemporary writers describe the sun as looking bluish, and get this, it casts no shadows. If you're wondering what kind of sun doesn't cast a shadow, you're asking the same question every terrified human was asking right before they started panic praying into their stew bowls. Over in China, the reports got even weirder. They claimed the stars were visible during the day. Just let that sink in for a second. You're out there tending your rice fields, you look up and you can see full-on constellations at 2 p.m. That's not just bad weather, that's the sky soft resetting in real time. And it wasn't just dim, it was bone-chillingly cold. With the sunlight filtered out by this mysterious, inconvenient veil, temperatures plummeted. This wasn't a cuddle-up with hot cocoa kind of cold. This was a your spring crops think it's January and your toes have stopped cooperating kind of cold. Since these people had zero concept of atmospheric science or what a volcano thousands of miles away was doing, they were left with one terrifying reality. The sun had stopped doing its job. And when your food, your warmth, and your general will to live depend on that one job, you've got a massive crisis on your hands. But just when you think a dim sun is the worst of it, nature decided to turn the surreal dial all the way up to 11.
As the year dragged on, it became painfully obvious that the sun wasn't just having a moody week, the entire atmosphere had basically decided to act weird. Across every continent, the reports were the same, a lingering, dry fog that didn't behave like any weather anyone had ever seen. Normally, mist clears up by noon, and smoke at least smells like something's on fire. But this fog? It was like a vague, damp ghost following everyone around, killing the visibility and the vibe in equal measure. Procopius, our ever-grim Byzantine historian, reported that this ghost fog hung over the world for an entire year. Imagine 12 months of not seeing a clear blue sky, not knowing the time, and wondering if this was just what life looked like now. In the East, Chinese sources were recording yellow dust falling from the sky like some kind of toxic snow, and if that wasn't enough to make you lose your mind, they started getting summer snow. Imagine waking up in July to find your crops frosted over and your chickens looking at you like, bruh, what is happening? Even in Ireland, the record started speaking of a failure of bread, which is honestly the most poetic and tragic way to describe mass starvation. When the bread abandons you, you know you're in trouble. We now know this was all caused by massive volcanic eruptions, likely in Iceland, blasting billions of tons of ash into the stratosphere. It was basically nature's version of someone blowing out birthday candles with way too much energy and ruining the entire party. Ash and sulfate aerosols were hanging out in the sky, reflecting the sunlight away and making sure your winter jacket became a year-round fashion statement. But for the people of 536, it just felt like the world was being slowly erased. Crops wouldn't grow, rivers slowed to a crawl, and livestock were probably walking into the fog out of pure existential dread. And just when everyone thought they were getting used to this Twilight Zone reality, nature decided to spice things up by throwing in a bonus pandemic. As if the sun going on strike wasn't enough, science eventually caught up with the chaos, centuries too late to help anyone, of course. Historians and climate scientists finally went digging for answers, literally by drilling into ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica. What they found was a frozen receipt of the planet's massive tantrum. It turns out the sky went full Gothic because of a series of volcanic eruptions so violent they make modern disasters look like a backyard bonfire. We're talking about a primary eruption in Iceland that was so massive it ejected a literal blanket of ash into the stratosphere, followed by two more sequels in 540 and 547. It was basically the Volcanoes of Doom trilogy, and nobody was buying tickets for the front row. These eruptions didn't just make for a cool science fact, they created a global SPF 5000 layer that blocked the sun's warmth for years. In Mesopotamia, the economy straight up collapsed because the harvests failed. In Europe, grain prices didn't just go up, they skyrocketed to the point where your neighbor might sell his last goat for a sack of moldy oats. And remember, nobody in 536 had any clue what a volcano even was. They didn't connect the dim sun to a mountain thousands of miles away having a midlife crisis. They just looked up, saw a permanent twilight, and assumed God was in a catastrophically bad mood. But while the scientists focus on the ash and sulfur, the people on the ground were dealing with the volcanic winter. Global temperatures dropped by nearly 3 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much when you have central heating, but in the 6th century, that's the difference between a full pantry and watching your entire food supply turn into frozen mush. Wheat, barley, and grapes, the 3 pillars of a good time in the Middle Ages, all just sat in the dirt and gave up. Tree ring data from Scandinavia to North America shows the same story. Trees weren't growing, they were barely breathing. Spring became a total myth, and farmers had to watch their fields fail like a poorly planned group project. But hold up, because as the hunger set in and the world stayed cold, a new, much smaller and much deadlier villain was about to enter the chat. Just when people were starting to think that starving in the dark was the rock bottom of the 6th century, nature decided to introduce a new player to the misery team: disease. Enter the Plague of Justinian. This wasn't just your run-of-the-mill seasonal flu. This was the bubonic plague making its terrifying debut on the world stage. It hit at the absolute worst possible moment, which, let's be honest, was basically the theme of the entire decade. By 541, the sun still hadn't fully recovered, and everyone was already weakened by years of freezing and eating whatever roots they could dig out of the mud. Then the plague casually rolled into Constantinople on grain ships. Because of course it did. Nothing says apocalypse like a cargo hold full of infected rats to really put the cherry on your misery cake. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, it spread like wildfire through cities that hadn't exactly invented germ theory yet. We're talking fever, vomiting, and those nightmare-inducing swollen lymph nodes. It was the kind of thing that actually made people nostalgic for the famine. The death toll was staggering. Estimates say between 25 to 50 million people were wiped out across the Byzantine Empire and beyond. That's up to half the population gone in just a few years. You couldn't even walk down the street without seeing the bodies piling up. Even Emperor Justinian himself caught it. He managed to survive, but his empire was never the same. Military campaigns fizzled out, the government ground to a halt, and the average person was left wondering if they'd offended every god in the catalog. To the people on the ground, this wasn't a scientific event. It was God's megaphone, and it was screaming. But here's where it gets even darker, because while the cities were being hollowed out by plague, the rural villages were dealing with a social collapse that was turning neighbor against neighbor.
While the plague was turning cities into ghost towns, life for the average person in the countryside had turned into a literal survival horror game. Imagine waking up in a world where it's still dark, it's still freezing, and dinner last night was just a handful of boiled bark and a vague memory of what bread used to taste like. This wasn't just a bad year, it was a total breakdown of how humans were supposed to live. Food wasn't just scarce, it became the only currency that mattered. If you happened to have a single carrot and no kids to feed, you were basically the Elon Musk of your village. In places like Ireland and Britain, the social fabric didn't just fray, it snapped. Farmers, weakened by hunger, could not even till the soil, leading to a failure of bread that lasted for years. In China, the Northern Wei dynasty started to crumble because, let's be real, it's hard to convince people you have the mandate of heaven when they're eating grass to stay alive. Even the elite weren't safe. In Constantinople, nobles were selling off their family heirlooms just for a loaf of moldy bread. The psychological toll was probably the craziest part. Without a proper sun to mark the days, time itself started to feel like a suggestion. Was it Tuesday? Was it July? Nobody knew. They just lived in a permanent state of existential dread. People fled the cities to escape the plague, only to find the villages empty and the roads falling apart. It was like someone was slowly erasing civilization with a wet cloth. Rumors of demons, divine wrath, and the literal end of the world were the only things spreading faster than the hunger. But even after a decade of darkness, a tiny sliver of light was finally about to break through the ash. After years of death, darkness, and what must have felt like a never-ending divine prank, the world finally began to pull itself together. It wasn't like a movie where the clouds part and a choir starts singing. It was more like a long, tired sigh. By the early 540s, that suffocating ash veil finally started to thin out. The sun, looking like it was coming back from a very poorly explained vacation, started shining again, tentatively at first, like it wasn't sure if it was still invited to the party. Crops slowly, painfully began to grow again. They weren't exactly prize-winning harvests, but when the first green sprouts poked out of the dirt, people didn't cry from despair. They just stared in mild disbelief. In Constantinople, bread prices finally stopped acting like a rocket ship and stabilized. Bread, which had basically become a sacred artifact, was finally back on the menu. The Byzantine Empire limped forward, trying to patch the holes in its economy and pretending the whole sun-vanishing plague apocalypse thing had been part of the plan all along. But the trauma left a permanent mark on the human soul. Scholars think the doomy vibe of medieval literature, all those stories about the end of the world and cruel, cold gods, actually started right here in 536. Once you've lived through a year where the sun dies and the bread fails, it's pretty hard to go back to writing upbeat poetry about spring. Scandinavia re-emerged from the shadows too, although some historians think the sheer brutality of these years is what eventually pushed the Norsemen to sail out and become everyone else's problem as Vikings. They had survived the worst weather in history. A little raiding across the sea probably felt like a vacation. But wait, because while the world moved on, the planet was hiding the evidence of this crime in the one place nobody would think to look. For the longest time, the year 536 was just a weird, scary story buried in ancient books. Modern historians knew things had gone sideways, but they could not prove why the sun had ghosted humanity. Unless you were willing to accept God is mad or demons ate the sky as a scientific consensus, the case was cold. It wasn't until the 20th century when we started drilling into the Earth's passive-aggressive memory sticks, otherwise known as ice cores, that the mystery finally cracked. Scientists pulled these long cylinders of ancient ice from Greenland and Antarctica, and what they found was a literal crime scene. Locked inside those frozen layers were massive spikes of sulfur and ash dating exactly to 536 AD, with follow-up hits in 540 and 547. This was the smoking gun. It wasn't a curse, it was a volcanic cataclysm. One massive eruption, likely in Iceland, followed by others in Central America or Indonesia, had essentially double-tapped the planet's climate. These weren't just standard eruptions, they were powerful enough to blast ash straight into the stratosphere, where it hung out like a toxic ceiling, reflecting the sun's rays back into space and plunging the world into a literal freezer. We can see it in the tree rings, too, tiny, stunted lines that show the trees were basically holding their breath for a decade. It's a chilling reminder that our entire civilization, with all its grand empires and high-speed tech, still lives at the mercy of the giant molten rocks under our feet. 536 was the year the Earth reminded us who's really in charge, leaving behind a legacy of darkness that changed the course of history forever.